Hi everyone, it's Trent here. Hope you're doing well. Welcome to What's Not My Room. This will probably get old kind of quickly, but I'm recording this video a little earlier than usual today because I felt inspired, and I have like a 20-minute window of time before I go into town to meet up with a friend for lunch, which is an excellent plan to have. You know, gives a sort of direction to my day already. I mean, I did some good writing just earlier, and maybe in connection with my writing, which is kind of on aesthetics at the moment, as you might know, because I've said it in previous videos. I was struck by a comment by a person on my video from yesterday, who said that who offered me, I guess, a very meaningful and very much appreciated compliment about the fact that the way I speak has a certain poetic quality to it. Now, I'm not saying that I complacently accept that compliment. I mean, I'm not the one to say, but at the same time, I would lie if I said that I never contemplated my expression, my vocal expression, my verbal expression in speaking, but also in writing, as partly inspired by poetic insight, but not just poetic insight, also I guess in general the practice of poetry. In my current notebook, the poetic passages, the obviously poetic passages, are I would not necessarily say few and far between, but they're not the most numerous or the most obvious. However, if you have a look at my blog, which I think there is a link to on YouTube, if you have a look at my blog, my WordPress blog, that is, called rencontini.wordpress.com, that's the address, you notice I wrote 1,500 aphorisms, which are the starting point, a large spread over a few years of writing, starting point of what is currently my investigation in the notebook, the Open Monism notebook. And so there has always been this relationship in my thinking and in my writing between like getting a certain insights about nature of reality, nature of knowledge, nature of action, nature of judgments, whatever is philosophically interesting, and the attempt to express the most unique grain of that insight, or the most singular and innermost grain of that insight, by the means of allegory or aphorism or poetry. I mean, these, or metaphor, these approaches are means of expressions, of tropes, are linked, of course. And in many ways, this has always kind of been intuitive to me. Not just intuitive in the sense that I do it almost naturally when I'm writing, but also it's what I like doing the most. It's what gives me the most pleasure. It's the format, the sort of this partly poetic format is really the way in which I feel the happiest at the possibility of expressing the kernel of what I want to express. It's almost as if when I'm not using poetic language, or at least when I'm not making use of some poetic expressions or metaphors or analogies when I'm writing, I'm almost like bound to fail at trying to express not just the substance of what I'm thinking, but obviously also what I'm hoping has a certain fragment of originality in what I'm talking about, because honestly, if I didn't think that there was such a fragment of originality, of potential surprise, and with it potential inspiration to viewers or listeners or readers, I probably wouldn't have the motivation to write in the first place or to share my thoughts in the first place. So all this is linked, feeling pleasure at that kind of mode of expression, feeling like it's also the most natural, and so the most effortless, although that doesn't mean that it doesn't require effort. It requires a lot of effort, but it's almost like expressing myself that way doesn't require like costly efforts. It's effort that I'm willing to produce until I'm literally too tired to continue. You know, what stops the effort is fatigue, psychological fatigue, sometimes physical or even emotional fatigue, rather than having had enough, cloyingness, feeling sickened by too much discussion in that mode of expression. So this, I guess, is beginning to throw light on why I very much enjoyed reading this comments, because it really struck a chord with me, you know. It struck a chord with me because it does partake of my life and my way of seeing things, I guess, and my desire to ever so slightly, or at my modest level, attempt to share a bit of that way with other people, to the extent that they can understand it, appreciate it, relate to it. And so, you know, there is a link between all that I just talked about, having, you know, maybe expressing myself in a poetic fashion, at least to an extent, having a certain poetic quality to one's expression, which is not something that I ascribe to myself like gratuitously. It's not something that I would ever claim for myself, because I think it's a difficult thing, and I'm not the one to claim it for myself, but I still like hearing it if people think that. There is a link between that and the broader concept of truth, and even more broadly with the philosophical discipline. Since I'm probably going to be addressing people who are more interested in typology, I'll try to make it relevant to typology as well, but only in a sort of peripheral fashion. This video is probably going to be called something like Poetry is Truth, or Poetry is Truth, or Truth as Poetry, or something like that. So that becomes the topic to be tackled. Not so much my personal history with attempting to express myself in poetic or metaphorical or allegorical fashion, which I don't always do. You know, the readers of my blog on the INFJs.com forum, where I publish every 2 days, I publish 20 entries from my current notebook. They know that like sometimes I go through phases where for 2 months I'll dump on them like a lot of more logical or technical stuff, which I need to do in order to later give more weight to the poetic expression of the wider apparatus that I have created and tinkered with, including in its more logical articulations, which are necessary if you want to create a system. You know, it all comes together. Like there's a holism to a systematic approach. You can't just say I want to express myself poetically. In philosophy, also have to tackle questions that have to do with language and logic and knowledge and the tools, the conceptual tools, the equipment that you're going to be using, interpretive equipment that you're going to be using to discuss these questions cannot be only poetic. At least, if you're aiming for something that has a bit of a scent of the system about it, which was my purpose with open monism, which is still my purpose with open monism. In any case, I think that in my notebook there is a lot of stuff that is quite technical, sometimes quite logical, and then there's stuff that is more evocative, metaphorical, mystical. And it does kind of capture me, I think. And it captures probably also why I identify so much with philosophers in history that have had an approach that at their higher level resembles mine. You know, I think in particular of obviously Schopenhauer, Wittgenstein, both capable of great technicity. So Schopenhauer in relation to his Kantianism, you see it especially in his doctoral thesis on the principle of sufficient reason and the fourfold root. And Wittgenstein, in fact, Wittgenstein has some Kantian little traits, I guess, whiffs of Kantianism in the Tractatus, in the first of his well-known books. But I would say in general, Wittgenstein as one of the inventors of analytic philosophy and philosophy of logical analysis, of proposition analysis, which his writings exemplify next to a lot of very mystical insights. So that's something that I not only love, but it's something that speaks to me. And Heidegger is similar. Although Heidegger is maybe, well, I guess the first Heidegger before the turn, the Heidegger of Being and Time is more technical. Post-turn, definitely more poetic. But if you take the whole of Heidegger, there are still these two aspects. And Heidegger is a thinker that influences me. Interestingly, Heidegger is not seen as a TI user in any case, regardless of whether you see him as an ISTJ or an INTJ, which are the two main hypotheses. TIUs would not be the most, at work in Heidegger's and I agree with that. I think he's more of a NIT user. Some of my respected subscribers think he's more of an SIT user, but in any case, no TI. Whereas Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein would be INFJs, or traditionally seen as such, and I would agree with that statement. I probably will make videos on, as some of you expect, on Wittgenstein and Schopenhauer as INFJs in the future. At some point, when I feel like it, when I feel like I have the excitement and something kind of a little bit potentially surprising to say, or otherwise, I'd rather wait a bit. But Heidegger, poetry, truth. Truth as poetry, poetry as truth. So how am I going to tie this all in, including by referring back to the comment that I got about the way in which I express myself, potentially maybe a little poetically sometimes. It's not so hard for me now to see how this all connects, but I'm going to have to try and see whether I can make this intelligible to the viewer. You see, one of the ways in which Martin Heidegger made a great impact on philosophy in the 20th century is that he essentially proposed to, if you wanted to boil it down to its bare essentials, the visions that he proposed is really a way of looking at the world differently than we have hitherto, or at least before him. So he proposes to reinterpret the history of philosophy and the history of, if you take philosophy as a way of looking at the world, which I guess you could take it as that, Heidegger comes up with something new, or at least he says he comes up with something new by paying attention to what people were doing before Plato. And that's ever since Plato, the history of philosophy has been characterized by the oblivion of being, which is maybe an expression that you've heard. And Heidegger reconstructs this history of the oblivion of being and how we can come back to recollecting and bringing to presence being again from the standpoint of our own era in the 20th century, and how to bring being back in a way, while taking stock of what has been done as part of this oblivion, which Heidegger sees as the task of philosophy, the task of thinking, perhaps even more than the task of the philosopher. And this way of looking at the world is really defined by the phenomenological approach, the first articulated by Brentano and Husserl, and then which Heidegger developed into this existential approach, which is what he proposes as this new way of looking at the world. And it's a poetic way, especially from the turn onwards, so after being and time. But you see that already germinating in being and time. I'm very much committed to the idea that there's no two Heideggers. There's no two Wittgensteins either, but there's certainly not two Heideggers, but there's Heidegger moving post being and time and realizing that he didn't go far enough in the way in which he wanted to articulate his new vision. So how to show what is meant by truth as poetry, and poetry as truth, and how to show in a very simple manner the way in which Heidegger's books were seminal in really catapulting this new approach to the foreground. I think that's maybe the way in which it can be best explained. And again, it's something that relates to the way in which I try to express myself, because I'm more of a Heideggerian in the sense that I'm very much influenced by existential phenomenology in my approach, not just in philosophy, but in my view of the world. I tend to see myself as a philosophizing person, as a philosopher, certainly not only in my writing, but in the way I am, because the way in which you see me here is the way in which I always am. Is that to say, well, in general, when we go outside, say, like, I'm going to go outside in a few minutes now, and I'm going to get on a bus. And on my way to the bus, I'm going to have a little walk. You know, the seafront is not too far from here, but there's I'll have to stroll down an avenue with trees, let's say. So imagine that I'm strolling down the avenue and I kind of pass by the first tree that I see. What Heidegger essentially says is that my encounter with this tree, when I see it, any tree, but let's say a particular tree, the most intimate dimension of that encounter is the closest to the meaning of what being is. But it's very, very difficult for a human being to express that meaning. Often we will just tend to say, well, a tree is, well, you know, a lot of people among us, the no-nonsense people, will say a tree is just a tree. Other people will say, well, a tree, listen, it has a trunk, has branches, it has leaves. Other people who are maybe more versed in chemistry and biology and other natural sciences will be able to tell you the chemical compounds, the molecules, everything that, you know, everything that composes a tree at a chemical level. What is the physics of the tree also, you know? So we have all these different ways of telling what a tree is. But what Heidegger says is that this is not the truth about the tree. Of course, these are different ways of expressing what a tree is, but what Heidegger says, if I understand him correctly, is to say when you encounter a tree, just in the way that you encounter anything in the world, the first way in which you encounter things is by things making themselves present to you. Something comes to the fore, something unconceals itself, it comes to the fore. And you experience the being of the tree pre-reflectively. Whereas until Heidegger, the whole history of philosophy, at least since Plato, has been embedded in a reflective relationship with beings and things and the world, including beings and things in the world and being oneself with beings and things in the world. We tend to reflectively apprehend things, thinking that that is the most basic way in which we can experience things, whether they be a window or a tree or a lake or a bridge. Heidegger is very fond of these basic elements of man's dwelling in the world, you know, the bridge, the river, the grass, the bench. And I do think that these things, prior to their being objects, because when you start thinking in terms of objects, you're already conceptualizing them reflectively. You're already sort of saying they are objects for me as a subject. But Heidegger thinks prior to the subject. He considers that the subject is something that is reflexive and doesn't capture the primordial and originary experience of what it means to be in the world next to things, to let things unveil themselves unconceal themselves, disclose themselves as presence next to our own presence. But if you conceive of the most basic and innermost nature of one's experience and existential being in the world like this, you cannot really tell the truth, if you like, about your experience in the language of reflective thinking. Because then you would be translating the primary experience into a second order experience, into the reflective, propositional, logical articulation of the experience as either, you know, the tree as a tree, or what has the name tree, or the tree as what has a trunk and leaves, or the chemical compound, the molecules, the cells, you know, like all these are regional ontologies to Heidegger. When he says regional ontologies, he respects them, these forms of ontology, but he doesn't think that they're like fundamental. The fundamental ontology for Heidegger is the ontology of being. The being of the tree as it manifests itself, as it unconceals itself in its presence to me when I walk by it and when I experience it pre-reflectively. But for Heidegger, and I agree with him in that sense, if you want to try to capture this experience in its most profound sense and truth, you can only express it poetically. Because poetry, in this sense, is the attempt to speak, to let things stand and speak their own truth to you as an event, rather than as a logical correspondence between, let's say, a statement and a state of affairs in the world, or as a semantic form of validity of statements in relation to one another, etc. But truth as an event, as the event of the unconcealment of things to us. And for this, there is only the language of poetry that can, if not achieve the expression of this truth of being as an unconcealment, but to try to get as near to it as possible. And this is the task of the poet. Now, I'm not saying that I achieve that myself, but I think that in many ways, Heidegger has a point. And I do try to do that. Now, in a future video, I will tell you more about the way in which, as part of this broader picture and of the task of the existential phenomenologist and things and the truth of the events of the presencing of things, I'll talk a little more about what I disagree with Heidegger, because I do in many ways. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, guys, and have a lovely day.